generation, becoming like Christ together, a key aspect of being formed in faith is to exist in community with one another. And a part of community is to share a meal with each other, to break bread together. So I hope you can all stay and share a meal with us and fellowship with one another. This morning, our series will take a slight shift in focus. We've been looking at the past few weeks that how faith is formed in community, that we become like Christ together as we exist in an intergenerational community of believers. We saw that Scripture commands and presumes that for someone to be formed into the image of Christ, for someone to become like Christ, they need to live, exist, and grow within community in which all ages are present together. And we saw that if we want to avoid losing young adults and children, the younger generations of faith, and want to keep them committed to the life of the church, then we must practice this intergenerational ministry. Scripture commands and presumes that this is where faith is formed. But now we have to ask, what do we do in this community? What does this intergenerational community look like? What activities do we do? What do we do in community with one another? So these are the questions to which we now turn. And now, if you may look at most churches across America today and say, well, most churches have people of all generations in their membership. And that's true. Most churches do have people across the generations present in their members. But we have to be clear about our terms. Just because a church includes members of all generations doesn't mean they're intergenerational. Many churches are what we call multi-generational churches, where they have all the generations present together, but this is not intergenerational ministry. Alden and Ross, the book we've been looking at for the last few weeks, writes, while many churches are multi-generational and seemingly healthy on the surface, in reality, the generations act like ships in the night that pass one another by and rarely have meaningful contact and interaction. This lack of significant communication and relation between the generations must be addressed if churches are to thrive and not merely survive, now and in the future. Alden and Ross argue and show that for churches to counter this decline of younger generations, to counter losing younger generations of the people of faith, churches must practice this intentional intergenerational ministry. The generations must intentionally, meaningfully interact and engage with one another. The old must interact and meaningfully engage with the young, not just sit together in services. We need that meaningful interaction. And so that's the idea to which we now turn. Beginning this week and over the next few weeks, we're going to look at what are things, how do we intentionally interact with one another? What are ways we can better do that and live an intergenerational community together? And this morning, to give us some guidance in this, we're going to be looking in the Old Testament. We're going to look for some wisdom of the ancients. It should be becoming clear over the past few weeks, this idea of intergenerational ministry, though it might be a new term to us, is not a new idea. This is something that has been practiced by the people of faith throughout the centuries. And up really until the 20th century, it was the norm for churches. Intentional intergenerational ministry. And we're going to look at some ancient wisdom for this. And, I've probably said this before, but we're going to look at the Jewish people. And what's amazing about the Jewish people, here's a group of people that have suffered persecution, war, genocide, every form of racism imaginable. A people and a religion that survived the pogroms of Russia, the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, and even face neo-Nazism still today. But yet a group of people and a religion that survived all these centuries. And if you want an example of how to sustain the generations, how to keep younger generations committed to the community of faith, we need to look no further than God's people Israel. The Jewish people are an excellent exemplar of intergenerational ministry. And the secret to their longevity already lies within their scripture and their cultural practices. Though they would not have used the term intergenerational ministry is something that the Jewish people have been practicing from the beginning, as we're going to see this morning. And just for an example, we looked a couple of weeks ago at Deuteronomy 29, the covenant ceremony there. And we saw that all the ages together, all generations entered God's covenant together as one people. They entered on level ground, the plain of Moab. So we see this practice of intergenerational ministry is foundational to God's people. This morning, the Jewish people have something further to teach us about this. They have something further to teach us about how faith is formed in this type of community and what that may look like. This morning, we're not looking at any one particular text, but a collection of texts that are used in the paramount Jewish holiday, the Passover. Now, I know you all have done a Passover meal, a Passover Seder before, but as a way of refresher, the Passover is the celebration of God's deliverance of the Jewish people in the Exodus. The Passover and the Exodus become the paradigm of God's salvation and deliverance of His people. And it remains today still the most celebrated Jewish holiday. And in this holiday, as we're going to see, it's an excellent exemplar of intergenerational ministry, the wisdom of the ancients. Now, before looking at Passover, I want to look at the Jewish festivals broadly speaking. If we look at the Jewish festivals, and Passover is the prime example of this, at all major religious events in Israel, all the generations gather together. At all the religious festivals, holidays, and celebrations, all the generations of God's people were present together and interacting together. And the events were intentionally intergenerational. They actively involved old and young alike. Every generation had a role to fulfill. The wisdom of the ancients is that life is full of teaching moments. Life is full of teaching moments. The Jewish people recognized that the best way to form their children, the best way to shape the younger generations into the life of the community of faith was to have them actively participate in the faith community's traditions and activities. To have them actively participate in the rituals, the symbols, and traditions of the community of faith. The Jewish people, at the Jewish festivals such as Passover, these were foundational teaching moments, formational events for the younger generations of the community. The purpose of the festivals was to remind the Israelites who they were, who God was, what God had done for them in ages past. As children and teens danced and sang and ate and listened to the stories and asked questions, they came to know who they were and who they were to be. The great religious festivals of the Jewish people were and still are these powerful teaching moments for God's people Israel. And the children at these events, the teens at these events, they weren't just passive observers. They were active participants. They were integral to the festivals themselves. They had roles to fulfill. And this allowed the children to have a deep sense of belonging to the community, that they are indeed of this community. The wisdom of the ancients is that life is full of these teaching moments, and this is the whole idea of intergenerational ministry, teaching and learning together with all ages present. Scripture commands that we practice this. And one of the main reasons to do this, as we're going to look at this morning, is the Scripture argues that one of the primary ways faith is formed is when the young in faith learn from the old. That the old pass on and exemplify the faith to the younger generations. And in order to do that, Scripture says, you need to be present together. The old shall teach the young, and thus the title of our series, Generation to Generation. One generation passes on and teaches the faith to the next. As the quote we've looked at a couple of times from James Frazier, the best way to be formed in faith is to sit among the elders. Listen to their stories, break bread with them, drink from the same cup, observing how these early generations of saints ran the race, fought the fight, and survived in grace. A major focus of intergenerational ministry is to allow one generation to teach the next, to allow the old to pass on the faith to the young, to allow the young to learn from the wisdom and experience of the old. Now, I do want to clarify, as we'll see in a sermon in a couple of weeks, faith formation is not a one-way street. The oldest don't teach the young. The young have something to offer the old as well. We'll look at it in a few weeks. But this morning, we're going to focus on this idea of the old teaching the young. The young learning the faith, learning from the wisdom and experience of the older generations of faith. And to do this, it is essential for the generations to be together. And this may seem like a simple idea, but it's actually more difficult than we might first suspect. But I think the Passover and the Jewish festivals have something to teach and offer us in this, about how to do this well. Now, Passover specifically served as an excellent exemplar of intergenerational ministry, the old passing on the faith to the young. Now, in the Passover, both ancient and modern, as you said, each generation had a role to fulfill. To begin the Passover celebration, the mother of the house would light the candle to begin the ceremony. The daughters would perform the ritual of washing hands to begin the meal. The youngest child would open the door so that Elijah may come in. The father and the grandfathers and the elders would teach and tell the story of the Exodus. And children of all ages would help prepare the meal. So each generation had a role and task to fulfill. It intentionally included all the generations working together for the celebration to be complete. Beyond the specific roles of each generation, Passover serves as an excellent exemplar of intergenerational ministry because of its focus on teaching. Its focus on giving opportunities for the old to teach the young. And one of the great challenges for any intergenerational community, the great challenge of intergenerational ministry is, how do I teach across such a broad age spectrum? How do I give enough content for adults while keeping the children engaged? And obviously, sermons probably aren't the best way to do that. But how do we teach across such a broad age spectrum? And here the Passover has some wisdom for us on how to do this well. Throughout the Passover, not only is the story retold, not only is the events of the Exodus recounted, but it has many activities, many ways that you enter the story through engagement in tangible activities that make the story real and present to the people today. Not only is there joyous singing throughout the festival, throughout the celebration and the meal, but you don't just talk about slavery. You don't just talk about the bitterness of slavery, but you eat horseradish. And if you've ever tasted horseradish, that's not a sour taste you soon forget. You don't just talk about your ancestors' tears, but you ate parsley dipped in salt water to remind you of those tears. You didn't talk about just your ancestors making bricks in Egypt, but you ate a dish called haroset, which is paste, and it reminds you of the mortar used for the bricks. You don't just talk about the plagues of Egypt, but you stick your fingers in your wine and drop a drop of wine onto your plate for each of the plagues. And if allowing your kids to stick their fingers in the food doesn't get them their attention, I don't know what will. You didn't just talk about needing to leave Egypt in haste, but you had unleavened bread. You eat unleavened bread as your ancestors did. Notice the tangibility of the festival. These little teaching moments throughout the story that allows even the youngest generations to learn and participate. The tangibility of the festival and that interaction allowed even what for adults could be a boring 2-hour storytelling to become a real and engaging event. The tangibility allowed even the youngest of children to learn to engage in the story. And all these practices, all these little acts throughout the story were intended to allow teaching moments for the younger generations. The religious festivals were these foundational teaching moments where the old could teach the young the story and the heritage of faith. And in these events, the Exodus became not just a set of facts to be memorized, not just a dead history, but it became a living, active story that you and your fathers and your grandfathers got to enter in together. The story became real to those present performing the celebration. It wasn't just history. And remember how the Passover, the retelling of the Passover begins. It begins with the phrase, when we were slaves in Egypt. When we were slaves in Egypt. And by saying we, it involves you. It involves the grandparents, all the fathers, the children, and their children. It involves all generations. It allows them to enter the story together. Again, this isn't just a dead history that happened in the past, but this is something we're involved in. Every generation is involved, and we enter God's story of redemption together and live it out. The religious festivals of the Jewish people have much to teach us about this practice of intergenerational ministry. I think there's a lot of wisdom here in these practices of how do we teach across the generations. But beyond this practical wisdom, the Passover exemplifies what we're talking about this morning. The old shall teach the young. It exemplifies this primary way Scripture believes faith is formed. And I've heard read throughout the service, and those that read, thank you, you did an excellent job. But we've heard read throughout the service 4 questions. 4 questions found throughout the Old Testament in Deuteronomy and Exodus. And these 4 questions became an essential part of the Passover story. As the fathers were telling the story of the Exodus, at one point in the story, the children, 4 different children would ask these 4 questions. And then they would be given replies and answers to teach them. Now we may ask why 4 questions. And the early Jewish rabbis noted these 4 questions in the story, and they also noted some differences between them. And they said these are the questions of 4 different children. Questions asked by 4 different types of children. So let's look at the questions here. The first question taken from Deuteronomy 6:20. It says, when your child asks you in time to come, saying, what do these testimonies, statutes mean, statutes and judgments mean, which the Lord our God commanded us? The rabbis saw this question. They saw the wisdom in this question. Notice the child distinguishes between the statutes, the judgments, and the testimonies. And they said, this is the question of the wise child, the child that has understanding. And the child is good because he or she includes themselves in the community. They say, what our God and commanded us. The child includes themselves in the community. They show discernment. And the rabbi said, the older generations have the duty to instruct this child in all the letters of the law, from the greatest commandment to the least commandment. You have a duty to teach this wise child. The next question is taken from Exodus 12:26. It says, when your child says to you, what does this right mean to you? They said, this is the question of the wicked child. Now, I didn't assign the text this morning, so whatever the question is, does not reflect who read it, just to clarify. But the rabbi said, this is the question of the wicked child. The wicked child, he has understanding. He asked about the right. But notice that he's wicked because he excludes himself from the life of the community. What does this right mean to you? It's a rhetorical question. He or she doesn't include himself as one of the community. And so the rabbi said, the old have a duty to teach this child in such a way so that they learn to include themselves in the community of faith. So that they learn the significance of this event. The next question, the third question, is taken from Exodus 13:14. And it shall be when your child asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? The rabbi said, this is the question of the good but simple child. The child doesn't have much understanding. That the child has interest. He shows interest by engaging and asking the question, but he doesn't know what to ask. And so the rabbi said, the old have a duty to teach this child in the best way that they can understand. The old have a duty to seek out ways in which this child can learn according to their ability. And the fourth and final question is taken from Exodus 13:8. You shall say to your child on that day, saying, and he gives an answer. But notice there's actually not a question here. The rabbis noted this and said, this is the question, this is for all those children who, for some reason, can't ask, either because of some inability or because they're too young to be able to ask a question. But the rabbi said, you have a duty to teach this child also, to teach according to their ability. And the inclusion of this emphasizes the importance, the focus of Passover, to teach all generations of faith, to teach and instruct all in the life of the community. The rabbis in their ancient wisdom recognized that festivals like Passover were especially important for this child, because though they may not have the understanding to ask and listen to a story, they can still learn from the tangibility of the festival that we talked about earlier. The child can still learn in these religious settings. So the four questions brings the point home, the focus of Passover. It emphasizes that the point of Passover is to provide those opportunities, those events, those interactions where the old have these opportunities to teach and pass on the story of faith to the next generation. The Passover enables the teaching of this, and in some ways we have our own practices. Mark talked this morning in his testimony about his experience of worship in the Catholic Church and their interaction and engagement, and how it involved the whole family going and receiving communion together. We have our own tangible events. These are things to think about for intergenerational ministry. How do we use those tangible elements of our services to teach the young in faith, to form one another in faith? So Scripture is commanding, it's the duty and responsibility of the older generations to pass on the heritage of faith, to tell the story of God's mighty saving acts, God's deliverance out of Egypt, God's deliverance in your own lives, to share your testimonies, to pass on the story of faith from one generation to the next. A major reason for this is given in Deuteronomy 6:2 and 3. He says, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments which I command you, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you in that day, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Scripture wants all generations to learn and be present together, to grow in faith together. And a primary way that is done is the old shall teach the young. The old tell the story of God's redemption not as a dead set of facts, but as a living story in which we are all active participants. For faith to be formed, the elders must pass on the faith from generation to generation. I want to go and invite the praise team up. But this morning, let us journey out of Egypt together. Let one generation teach the next. Let us sit among the elders, listen to their stories, break bread with them, so that we may be formed more and more into the image of Christ, as together we stand and